If you once loved, trusted, and opened your heart to a narcissist, you were not just hurt, you were drained. They did not strike you with their hands, they struck you with silence. They did not need to raise their voice. All it took was a colder look, a slight disappearance, a subtle denial, and you began collapsing from the inside. You explained more, you compromised more, you questioned where you went wrong. Meanwhile, they remained exactly where they were, calm, certain, in control. A narcissist is someone who lives off other people's emotions. They need to feel important, they need attention, they need to know you are still thinking about them, still hurting because of them, still reacting to them. Whether it is love or hate, as long as there is a reaction, they are winning. Because for a narcissist, power does not come from love. Power comes from their ability to affect you, to control your mind, to pull you away from yourself. That is why most conventional forms of revenge fail. Arguing only makes them feel significant. Anger proves they still matter. Begging, explaining, demanding fairness, all of it fuels the very thing they are addicted to, your emotional involvement. You think you are fighting them, but in reality, you are keeping them alive in your head. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Narcissists are not hurt by your suffering. They are only hurt when they lose their central position, when they are no longer your concern, when they are no longer the reason you lose sleep, when they can no longer control your emotions, your time, or your attention. And that brings us here. In today's video, we will talk about 5 ways to torture a narcissist, not through cruelty, not through reverse manipulation, and not through cheap revenge. These are 5 real internal shifts within you, and precisely because they are real, they are more devastating to a narcissist than any direct attack ever could be. And to truly see the mechanism behind everything you have been through, we have to begin with the one thing a narcissist fears most. The first way to torture a narcissist: reduce their significance in your life. It sounds simple, but for someone who lives off being the center, this is the most painful cut of all. A narcissist does not just want to be loved, they need you to orbit around them. They need to feel that they are the cause of your moods, the point your nervous system is constantly monitoring, the person you wake up thinking about. Are they okay today? What did I do wrong this time? As long as you place them in that position, whether you are crying, angry, arguing, or desperately trying to explain yourself, you are still feeding them the substance they crave most, your relevance. This is where many people get trapped. They believe that standing in the truth means talking until the other person finally acknowledges it. But with a narcissist, conversations are rarely about understanding, they are about maintaining power. That is why reducing their significance is not about pretending to be cold or detached. It is a gradual process of removing them from the center of your awareness, like pulling a fishhook out of flesh, painful but necessary. This step begins with a very real kind of grief. You are not only hurting because they wounded you, you are grieving the image you invested in, the version of them you believed would eventually appear if you were patient enough, gentle enough, understanding enough. Reducing their significance means daring to put a full stop to that version. They do not need to be saved in the way you imagined. Often, they only need you to stay so they never have to face the emptiness inside themselves. When you accept this, you are doing something your brain will initially resist with intensity. You are removing them from the role of the one who determines my value. In reality, not everyone who shows narcissistic behavior meets criteria for a personality disorder. However, large epidemiological surveys have found that lifetime prevalence rates of narcissistic personality disorder can reach roughly 6%, and maybe even higher in early adulthood. These numbers remind us that this is not a rare anomaly, but a recurring psychological power structure in society. And the torture here is not about labeling anyone with a diagnosis. It is about recognizing the structure of control. A narcissist is most stable when you treat them as the benchmark for your peace. You text to guess their mood. You go quiet to test their reaction. You smile to avoid provoking anger. You apologize to calm the storm. That entire pattern of adaptation is the doorway through which they gain access. Reducing their significance means closing that door through very ordinary discipline. You stop checking on them in your mind every hour. You stop writing internal scripts that excuse their behavior. You stop treating their satisfaction as proof that you are doing it right. You shift your focus from, "What are they thinking about me?" to, "What is happening in my body when I am around them?" It sounds subtle, but it is revolutionary. Narcissistic dynamics operate on immediate emotional reactions, pulling you into response while you begin operating on a long-term plane. Protecting your nervous system. When you reduce their significance, a very specific reaction often appears. They grow restless. They escalate attempts to provoke you, not because they suddenly care more, but because they sense the center seat slipping out of their grasp. Social psychological research shows that individuals with narcissistic traits react strongly to ego threats being devalued or dismissed, and may increase direct or indirect aggression when they feel slighted. This helps explain why, when you remove their central role, they may become sarcastic, hostile, or guilt-inducing in an attempt to pull you back in. That is why step 1 is not about driving them crazy. Step 1 is about withdrawing fuel safely. Safety means this: if you are in a situation involving violence, financial dependence, custody issues, employment control, or surveillance, do not confront, prioritize exit planning, legal support, and therapy. But if you have the space to do this work, understand that reducing their significance does not happen through one dramatic statement. It happens through consistency. You respond less, shorter, more neutral. You stop circular explanations. You stop putting your emotions on the table for them to manipulate. You stop teaching them how to love you, because you now understand. Those who want to understand will ask. Those who want control will redirect. Most importantly, you rebuild a life where they are no longer the center. Your routines, friendships, work, body, sleep, interests, and goals. This is the true torture for a narcissist. They watch you continue to live without needing them to feel valuable. They see you stop explaining, stop begging, stop proving. And suddenly, they lose access to your nervous system. When you complete this first step fully, something unexpected happens. You no longer want to win arguments with them. You only want peace. And for a narcissist, your peace means their power is gone. And once their central position begins to loosen, the next thing a narcissist fears most comes into view. The second way to torture a narcissist: disrupt their idealized self by remaining calm and anchored in reality. A narcissist does not live through their authentic self. They live through an image, a carefully constructed story about who they are: smarter, deeper, more special, more misunderstood, more self-sacrificing, or more powerful than those around them. This is the idealized self, often called the false self, a shell that can only survive if it is constantly reflected back to them. And the only thing that feeds this shell is external validation. In the relationship, you likely became that mirror without realizing it. You listened to the same stories. You praised at the right moments. You avoided fragile points. You adjusted your words to protect their image. Over time, you were not just loving them, you were maintaining their self-image. That is why, when you stop doing this, their reaction can be far more intense than expected. Disrupting the idealized self does not mean exposing or attacking them directly. Those approaches often backfire and can put you at risk. What wounds a narcissist most deeply is when reality no longer matches the story they tell, and you stop fixing the mismatch for them. You do not argue, you do not explain at length, you simply withhold validation. In practice, this looks quiet and ordinary. When they exaggerate achievements, you do not challenge but you do not admire. When they cast themselves as the victim, you do not deny but you do not overcomfort. When they perform power, charm, or superiority, you respond with brief, neutral remarks that do not feed the performance. You do not laugh on cue. You do not ask follow-up questions to keep the show going. The stage remains, but the audience has left. Psychologically, This creates a form of narcissistic injury, not loud, but deep. Research indicates that individuals high in narcissistic traits are especially sensitive to signals of devaluation or lack of recognition, and their reactions are often disproportionate to the trigger. In other words, simply failing to mirror them correctly is enough to activate their defenses. Crucially, you do not need to call them out to disrupt the image. What they cannot tolerate is calm adherence to reality. You use simple, hard-to-attack statements. I understand that's how you see it. Maybe, I'm not sure. I see it differently. No sarcasm, no confrontation, no lecturing. Just reality that refuses to bend. When the idealized self is no longer fed, narcissists tend to react in predictable ways. First, escalation. They perform harder, talk more, dramatize more to reclaim attention. Second, devaluation. They belittle or mock you to reassert hierarchy. Third, victimhood. They become wounded, abandoned, mistreated, attempting to pull you back into soothing them. Recognizing these patterns helps you avoid being drawn back into the cycle. There is an even deeper layer to this step. You stop allowing them to define reality. Before, when they said, "You're too sensitive," you questioned yourself. When they said, "It's not a big deal," you doubted your feelings. Now, you no longer need to prove anything. You treat your experience as data. You do not argue to win. You retain the authority to interpret your own reality. And for a narcissist, losing that authority is losing power. This requires inner discipline, because your nervous system has been conditioned to regulate theirs for safety. When you stop, anxiety may rise in the short term, but over time, you shift from external control to internal stability. You are no longer living inside their narrative. You are living inside your own truth. And this is the core point. Narcissists do not collapse when attacked. They collapse when they are no longer reflected. When you calmly return them to reality without polishing, rescuing, or shielding, the idealized self begins to crack. Not because you did something dramatic, but because you withheld the one thing they needed most. You are no longer the mirror. And without the mirror, they are left facing the void they have spent their entire lives trying to avoid. After you have accomplished the first two steps, removing them from the center of your life and reducing their significance, there is still a deeper, more ruthless layer. This is the level most survivors never reach, because it does not live in words, arguments, or visible strategies. It lives in the most difficult place to reclaim: your emotional reflexes. The third way to torture a narcissist is this: you stop being their emotional nervous system. A narcissist does not survive on attention alone, they survive on your emotional reactions. Fear, anxiety, hope, anger, guilt, longing. These are not side effects, they are the fuel. Over time, especially in trauma-bonded relationships, the empath becomes an external regulator for the narcissist's inner chaos. They offload tension onto you, test control through your reactions, and adjust their behavior based on how strongly you respond. Neurologically, this is not metaphorical. Research on trauma bonding shows that emotionally abusive relationships create dopamine-cortisol cycles similar to addiction: stress, followed by relief, pain followed by hope, repeated over time. Your nervous system learns to monitor the narcissist as a threat signal. You stop responding by choice and start responding by conditioning. And this is the system the narcissist depends on most. They do not need you to love them. They only need you to react to them. Your heart racing when they text. Your stomach tightening when they go silent. Your mind replaying conversations to locate your mistake. At this stage, you are no longer emotionally autonomous. You become an extension of their nervous system. They provoke you, activate. They withdraw you, destabilize. They return you, hope. Regardless of whether you fight or stay quiet, they retain the core power, control over your internal state. The third method begins when you face a difficult truth. What keeps you stuck is not love, it is reflex. And reflexes can be extinguished, but not through insight alone, not through forgiveness, not through understanding them better. They are extinguished through nervous system discipline. Ending emotional reactivity does not mean becoming cold. It means you deny them direct access to your nervous system. You insert a pause between stimulus and response, a small gap but enough to shift power. Instead of replying immediately, you wait. Instead of explaining, you observe. Instead of defending, you check your body first, your breath, your muscles, your heartbeat. This stage is profoundly uncomfortable at first. Your brain will protest. It has learned that reacting equals safety. But that false safety is precisely what sustained the narcissistic dynamic. When you stop reacting automatically, the narcissist experiences deep structural panic, not loud panic, systemic panic, because the familiar system fails. They provoke, you do not explode. They withdraw, you do not chase. They confuse, you do not decode. Studies on narcissistic injury show that when emotional supply is cut, individuals with narcissistic traits escalate behaviors, becoming more provocative, more charming, or more hostile, not because they are changing, but because they are searching for the old button and it no longer works. You do not need to announce that you are unaffected. Your altered rhythm already communicates it. A critical safety note is required here. This method is not safe in relationships involving physical danger, financial dependence, legal threats, or stalking. When control is threatened, some narcissists escalate. In those cases, safety and professional support come first. But where it is safe to practice, this is the most devastating method because it offers nothing to fight against. You do not insult them. You do not expose them. You do not create drama. You simply stop vibrating. And this strikes the narcissistic core. Narcissists do not possess stable emotional selfhood. They require external reflection to feel real. When you stop serving as that mirror, they do not just lose you, they lose coherence. At this stage, you begin to notice subtle changes. You think about them less urgently. Your body feels lighter. Your sleep improves. Not because they changed, but because your nervous system is no longer hijacked, and that is the moment real power shifts. After you have done what the third method requires, ending emotional reflexes and refusing to function as their external nervous system, you start to see something even more unsettling. A narcissist does not only feed on your reactions, they feed on something deeper. They feed on a reality they manufacture. And much of their power does not come from being stronger than you. It comes from keeping you trapped inside a distorted story long enough that you forget your own. That is why the fourth way is not about hurting them with words, exposing them publicly, or seeking revenge. It is not about becoming cruel. It is a cold, structural move. You remove their right to define reality in the relationship. You stop helping them rewrite history. You stop playing a supporting role in a movie where they are always the hero or the victim. You stop participating in the psychological ritual that keeps their ego clean. In other words, you break the illusion system with stable truth. A narcissist survives behind two layers. The first layer is your emotional reactivity, the supply you begin cutting off in the third method. The second layer is the narrative they tell, not only to you, but to themselves and to everyone around them. That narrative has one purpose: protect the image. So when they hurt you, they typically do not repair, reflect, or take responsibility. They do something else. They restructure the story, so they remain justified, superior, and blameless. And if you are still inside that loop, you end up doing exhausting work you may not even recognize. You become the one carrying morality for them. You carry clarity, you carry sincerity, you carry repair, while they glide on the surface with phrases like, "You are too sensitive," "You are overthinking," "It was nothing," "Why are you making it a big deal?" And the moment you react, they pivot. Now the problem is not what they did, it is your reaction. That is the art of shifting the spotlight. And once the spotlight shifts often enough, you lose your own center. So, the fourth method is this: you become a reality anchor they cannot bend. You do not need to win. You do not need to persuade them. You do not need to force accountability out of them. You only need to do one thing: refuse to let your internal history be rewritten. This is the hardest step for many empathic people, because you tend to believe that if you explain clearly enough, they will finally understand. But look directly. Many narcissists do understand. They simply cannot accept a reality that would require responsibility. And arguing about truth with them often feels like holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. The coldness of this step is not cruelty, it is independence. Your truth no longer requires their permission. Practically, it begins with a specific shift. You stop debating versions and return to events. When they say, "I never did that," you refuse to enter an endless explanation spiral. You ask yourself privately, what happened? How did my body react? What is the repeating pattern? Because what breaks you is not one argument. What destroys you is repeated exposure to a warped reality so constant that you start doubting your own memory. So instead of endless discussion, you do the opposite. You reduce engagement with ambiguity. You do not argue inside the frame they built. You do not answer questions designed to make you defend your feelings as if your emotions must be approved to be valid. From there, you go one level deeper. You block the co-performance channel. Many survivors do not realize narcissists rarely manipulate alone. They manipulate through context, by pulling others into the story, by leveraging social charm, by making you look unstable while they look calm. This is why you feel isolated, not because you are weak, but because the environment has been preconditioned. The fourth method is not public exposure, which can be dangerous and backfire. It is removing yourself from the stage where they need an audience. You share less personal information with people who can be influenced. You stop trying to recruit validation from unreliable circles. Instead, you build a reality protection ring. Trustworthy support, clear information, consistent boundaries. The less stage you provide, the less power they have to perform. Because what a narcissist fears is a person who cannot be easily confused anymore. You become harder to manipulate when you live by principles, not moral lectures, but nervous system principles. What makes you shrink inward is data. What makes you lose sleep is data. What repeats and always ends with you apologizing for their harm is not miscommunication, it is manipulation. And once you name the mechanism, you stop being easy to swap and spin. Here is a critical substep, and it must be used correctly. You clarify boundaries with behavior, not debate. When they begin twisting the story, you end the conversation. When they deny, you do not chase proof. When they mock your emotions, you do not beg for kindness. You exit, you reduce access. You change the conditions under which they can reach you. This is not punishment. This is access restructuring. And for narcissistic dynamics, being denied access is far more terrifying than being hated, because hatred is still connection. Loss of access means the control panel is gone. At this stage, they commonly attempt one of three moves. They escalate aggression, mockery, devaluation, sarcasm. They become sweet in a sudden, exaggerated way, apologies with grand promises. Or they pull you into a moral debate, painting you as cruel for not moving on. The point is, you do not fight each tactic individually, you hold the structure. Your truth does not require their agreement. Your boundary does not require their consent. And here is why this becomes torture to them. When you do this consistently, their illusion begins to crack, not because you humiliate them publicly, but because illusion systems only survive with participants. Once you stop co-performing, they lose a mirror. You become unusable for image maintenance. You stop taking the role of too sensitive. You stop apologizing to keep them spotless. And gradually, they experience what they hate most. Exposure, not exposure of information, but exposure of powerlessness. They can no longer make you doubt your memory, your emotions, your right to be angry. One essential safety warning. If the relationship involves physical danger or retaliation through finances, employment, custody, or stalking, this method must be paired with a safety plan. Breaking the illusion does not mean direct confrontation. It can be quiet, narrowing contact, strengthening support, documenting reality for yourself, preparing an exit. The goal is not to break them with one dramatic strike. The goal is to stop living inside their reality. And when you complete the fourth method, something strange happens. You stop craving justice in the old way, because justice here is not an apology. Justice is no longer allowing your emotional reality to be erased. Justice is truth standing stable inside you. And to a narcissist, when you remove their right to rewrite reality, you remove one of their most essential foundations, the illusion of control. When you stop letting them rewrite reality and stop co-performing inside their narrative, something very specific happens inside you. You begin to feel empty, not empty in a meaningless way, but empty in the way a nervous system finally gets to breathe. And that space can scare people. If I'm not thinking about them anymore, who am I? That is one of the deepest traps narcissistic dynamics install. It is not only emotional dependence, it becomes identity dependence. You were trained to monitor their mood, decode messages, adjust your tone, and constantly ask, did I do something wrong? So when you begin to withdraw for real, your brain will fight back with cravings for closure, for one last conversation, for a final explanation, for a moment of justice. Sometimes it even feels like love, but very often it is not love, it is withdrawal. It is your nervous system, used to chronic activation, suddenly deprived of stimulation, so it labels the discomfort as destiny. This is where the fifth way, the final one, the cleanest one, the hardest one, and the most powerful one begins. You create a level of freedom that makes you inaccessible to them. Not inaccessible on your phone only, inaccessible in your nervous system, inaccessible in your attention, inaccessible in your mind, inaccessible in your daily rhythm. A narcissist can tolerate your anger. They can even feed on your pain. What they struggle to tolerate is this: you become unreachable. Not because you play games, but because your inner life truly changes your operating system, your self-definition, your priorities. You put safety and dignity above everything. This kind of freedom does not come from one dramatic sentence like, I don't need you anymore. It comes from small, repeated decisions until they become structure. And this structure has three layers: access, meaning, and future. The access layer is about communication, channels, and presence. If circumstances allow and it is safe, this is where no contact or minimal contact becomes a backbone. You reduce opportunities for them to reach you through ambiguity, bait, and emotional hooks. But the key is you do not do it as performance to make them jealous, to force them back. You do it as mental hygiene, because you understand the cost. They do not need a big move to get inside you again. A how are you, a half apology, a nostalgic memory, a vague accusation. That can be enough to put your nervous system back into surveillance mode for days or weeks. So freedom starts with protecting the door, not out of hatred, but out of respect for the price you pay every time it opens. But the stronger layer is meaning. Many people can cut contact and still keep the narcissist alive in their head. They keep replaying arguments, imagining future conversations, waiting for an apology that would finally calm their heart. That is invisible contact, and it is often their favorite kind. You are not speaking to them, but you are still orbiting them. So the fifth method requires a new cruelty, not cruelty toward them, but cruelty toward the loop inside you. You stop giving them central meaning. You stop treating them as destiny, as the biggest chapter of your life, as the wound that defines you. This is the subtle cut. You make them a chapter, not the entire book. Narcissistic power depends on exaggeration. They must be the most special person in your life, whether through love or through trauma. When you shrink them back to truth-size someone with a control pattern, someone without real repair capacity, someone who harms and then denies they lose their aura, you do not have to insult them, you simply see them accurately. And then comes the future layer. You build a life with an anti-manipulation architecture. People misunderstand healing as spiritual softness, forgiveness, letting go. But here, healing is design. You rebuild your life so the old pattern cannot thrive. You regulate sleep, food, movement not as shallow self-help, but because a regulated nervous system is harder to bait. You create routine, goals, and community not to prove anything, but because isolation is the ideal ecosystem for manipulation. You relearn needs, boundaries, and the ability to tolerate someone else's disappointment. You do therapy or structured journaling not to vent forever, but to separate events from illusion, pain from self-blame. You learn early red flags, love bombing, push-pull cycles, blame shifting, denial, memory erasure, making you ask permission to feel hurt. And each time you notice the pattern, you do not debate, you withdraw. This is where the torture becomes a beautiful paradox. You do nothing to them, you simply build yourself. And that is what collapses their power, because their power rests on the belief that they can shape you, shrink you, confuse you, destabilize you. When you build a new life, you speak with behavior. You no longer have access. And what hurts them most is not your hate, it is your independence. You do not need them to exist. You do not need them to define reality. You do not need them to feel lovable. You become a closed system of dignity. Because this is the final method, it is also the stage where they often attempt re-entry the hardest. You may see the familiar returns, sudden kindness, dramatic remorse, self-awareness, stories about how broken they are, claims of transformation. Do not rush to debate whether they changed. The fifth method asks a colder question. Does their return lead you to long-term peace or back into the loop? Real change respects boundaries even when they do not get what they want. Real change does not require you to forget the past to keep them comfortable. And most importantly, real change does not demand your nervous system as the price of relationship. So you adopt an evidence rule. You do not decide based on emotion, words, or nostalgic memories. You decide based on patterns, time, and consistency. And one hard sentence belongs here. In many narcissistic patterns, the safest path is not helping them grow, but growing yourself out of their radius. Not because you are weak, because you finally understand the mechanism. When you reach complete freedom, the biggest shift is not them, it is you. You realize you were living in surveillance, as if it was your job, and now you quit that job. You laugh without checking who is offended. You sleep without decoding texts. You choose people who love you without requiring you to prove your worth. You do not need a final strike against the narcissist, because the final strike is structural. You made yourself a place they cannot enter. And that is the fifth way in its deepest meaning. You end the game by leaving the game and rebuilding your life in a place their power cannot reach. No stage, no performance, no reaction, no fuel. No rewritten reality, no illusion. And when you have a future, they no longer have a past strong enough to chain you. And when you look back at everything we have just walked through, you may notice something unexpected. None of these 5 ways require you to become crueler, sharper, or more ruthless than the narcissist. In fact, each one requires you to become clearer with yourself. Clear about what is happening. Clear about the cost you have already paid. And clear that you are no longer willing to pay it again. The 5 ways to torture we discussed, if named accurately, are not outward attacks, but 5 withdrawals of power. Withdrawing significance, withdrawing the mirror, withdrawing emotional supply, withdrawing the right to rewrite reality, and finally, withdrawing total access to your life. A narcissist does not collapse because you hurt them. They collapse because you are no longer a place where they can plug in and extract energy. The most important thing to take with you from this piece is this. You did not lose because you loved too deeply, waited too long, or gave too generously. You only lose when you believe you must stay in a game whose rules are constantly rewritten against you. The moment you realize you are allowed to leave the table, the balance of power begins to shift, even if nothing changes on the outside right away. If you are at the beginning of this journey, be honest with yourself. Leaving narcissistic influence is not a one-time decision. It is a series of daily choices, made while your brain still craves the familiar, your heart still aches, and good memories still knock on the door. What keeps you steady in those moments is not willpower, but structure. consistent routines, clear boundaries, reliable support, and when possible, professional therapy. You do not need to be heroic. You need to be consistent. If you are still in the relationship and cannot leave yet because of children, finances, work, or personal safety, remember, the goal is not to defeat the narcissist, but to minimize harm to yourself. In these situations, strategies like minimal contact, neutral communication, limited emotional sharing, and documentation when necessary are protective measures, not provocations. If there are signs of violence or threat, prioritize safety planning, legal support, and local resources. No psychological victory is worth your safety. If you have left but remain mentally trapped, replaying conversations, waiting for acknowledgement, seeking closure, be gentle but firm with yourself. Your peace does not live in the mouth of the person who destabilized you. It lives in your decision to stop letting them be the narrator of your life. You do not need their validation for your memories to be real. You do not need their apology for your pain to matter. Truth does not disappear because it is denied. It simply waits for you to stand beside it. And if there is one final, practical piece of advice, it is this. Do not measure your healing by whether they return, suffer, or realize. Measure it by ordinary things. Do you sleep more deeply, laugh more lightly, check your phone less? Stop asking permission to feel hurt, and begin to imagine futures that do not involve them. These are the real markers of freedom. When you build a life whose center is no longer reaction but safety and dignity, the narcissist will do what they always do: seek a new supply, a new stage, a new story. That is not your failure. It is proof that you have exited the role. You are no longer the audience, the co-star, or the fuel. You are the person who leaves the theater when the play is no longer worth watching. If you hear yourself in these words, remember, you do not need revenge. You do not need to win. You do not need to prove anything. What you need is a life no longer governed by the fear of losing them. And every small step you take, each time you choose calm, truth, and yourself, moves you further out of the game. And that is when the game truly ends.